We now turn to civic resistance and its evolving forms in illiberal context. The title of the panel is The Challenging Face of Civil Resistance in Illiberal Regimes, Cases from the Western Balkans. And our panelists, Andi Dobrushi, Director, Open Society Foundations, Western Balkans; Ferenc Németh, Western Balkans expert, PhD student, Doctoral School of International Relations and Political Science, Corvinus University; Srđan Cvijić, President, International Advisory Committee of the Belgrade Center for Security Policy; and Vujo Ilić, Research Fellow, Assistant Director, Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, University of Belgrade. The moderator is Hajdari, journalist at Politico. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I am incredibly honored to be moderating this panel with people who I consider to be both close friends, but also extraordinary experts in their field. And I think the topic of the ongoing protest movement in Serbia is one of the most important, not only for the Western Balkans region, obviously, but I think it's an extraordinary topic, extraordinarily important topic in Europe as well. There have been few, if not, I won't go as far as to say it's the biggest protest movement in the past 10 years, but it's one of the biggest protest movements in Europe in terms of its, how long it's lasted, the scope or the layers of society that it has incorporated into the movement, and the insistence of all segments of Serbian society and all corners of Serbia in participating in this movement. And so I really hope we can sort of shed light on what has inspired people to participate in this protest movement, and where it's going, and what it means, and hopefully if it can inspire others to, in countries facing similar challenges Serbia is facing, to act the same. I would start with Srđan Cvijić, who was introduced earlier, but I'd add another layer of introduction, that he has been someone who, every time I've spoken to you before this protest movement, you talked about your role in the protest movement that toppled Yugoslav/Serbian strongman Slobodan Milošević. And now you're seeing sort of a second wave, or an even bigger protest movement than the one that you grew up with in the 90s. Could you explain what makes this protest movement so important?
Thank you, Una. Well, yeah, I mean, the current protests, as you all know, started in November last year. Actually, the canopy fell on the 1st of November, and the first protests that were held on 5th and 8th of November in Novi Sad. They were organized by local students and activists from the organization staff, and by the local opposition. And what is interesting is that they didn't just come from nowhere. Every single previous protest, and we had many in Serbia since 2016, has been the breeding ground for the next one. So practically the young people who started the first protests in Novi Sad were, let's say, if you want, pushed into activism during the electoral fraud in December 2023. And then others were pushed into activism by the government's response to the environmental protest in the summer of 2024. So all this, yes, this is a new and novel protest, but it's a continuation of the previous ones. And why are Serbs so much on the streets? I mean, I think there is no need to explain to the Hungarians this, but since 2016, our state has been completely captured. All independent institutions basically annihilated. So the only way to express dissent and fight for justice is in the street, actually. And what makes this particular case damning for the regime, the canopy fall, is that infrastructure has been the crown jewel of of the Vučić regime and the collapse of the railway station canopy, a stark symbol of its crumbling promises of this regime. So it really hit the nerve there, and everyone has a story to tell about this canopy. Oh, you know, it's not just touching on people from Novi Sad. You know, I personally, with my wife and 2 daughters, we passed under the canopy 2-3 days before. So we could have been there, you know, since this railway station opened, and you probably saw it in Hungary as well. It's marked by this weird waving of Vučić and Orban to non-existent people at the railway station. Since it's opened, everyone has been passing through it again. So what makes this protest special is basically that when the student blockade started, and they didn't start immediately, they followed suit, and they started exactly because the regime attacked them while they were on a silent vigil. So there has been this incredible paradox that the regime's actions have been fueling the protests since the beginning. So what makes it particularly extraordinary, let me put it this way, is that it managed to quote the mayor Karačonj from this morning to create this incredibly wide social coalition. You know, from war veterans of the 1990s to the Bosniak students from Novi Pazar, you know, from left to right. Yes.
People on the streets feeding them and helping them.
People on the streets feeding them. So it really hit. It managed, as no protest before, to get to the core of the. And I think Vujo has more to say in this, to the core of the voters of the ruling party as well. This is what makes it peculiar. And, but okay, so this is the good story, let's say, that there is the civil society in Serbia, the Democratic Front is alive, very much so and kicking, but the repression of the regime has been extraordinary. I mean,
before we get to the negative sides, let me just focus on the positive. You rightfully said that there have been many protest movements over the years that they've built on top of each other, every single one, and there have been very long ones, ones that have lasted for similar long periods of time. But I still think that these ones are so, first of all, so monumental in the groups of people who are participating in them, and especially parts of Serbia where that are smaller, where the local SNS, so the local ruling party structures are much more ingrained in the way that they shape society. So people are usually more afraid of protesting, and that's happening more and more. Also, would you say that these protests have, unlike perhaps the other ones, even though the other ones have definitely affected the government, but like have struck a bit of a greater fear in the ruling coalition and the president of the country?
Absolutely. I mean, these protests managed to completely take away the advantage from the regime that has been always setting the tone of the public debate. So everybody else has been following the narrative of the regime and responding to it. These protests shortened the duration of the spin of the regime from a week on a topic to sometimes even a couple of hours. You know, it just doesn't work anymore. And the infrastructure of the ruling party in many towns in Serbia doesn't exist anymore. They're already powerless. Just that they just don't know it really, but they don't have the power. In Užice, in Čačak, you know, in many cities, they don't rule anymore. This is the new reality, but it's a big standoff, and this is where we come to the repression. You know, because you know, if you look at Serbia now compared to Hungary or other illiberal regimes, we are no longer there. We have gone down the road much more than here. you know, you remember the students I mentioned from the beginning that started the protests. Well, some of them are in political exile. Serbia, a candidate country for EU membership, has political exile, 6 of them, who are charged on bogus charges of sedition, and 6 other in house arrest. We have almost 1,000 arrested people when these protests started. We have women arrested in Novi Sad, stripped naked in the police station. So like Latin American junta style. So this is the level of repression. So the regime is completely weakened, but the only thing that they can do is respond like this. So it's a very worrying situation, generally speaking.
I would transition quickly to Vujo, but maybe keep it between you two for just a second. The other panelists will have fantastic contributions, but maybe just really set the scene for what's going on in Serbia. Vujo, can you, the backbone of the protests now, even though, like Srđan said, this wasn't what it started out as, are the student blockades or the student-led movement. Can you, again, give some background into what that happened, how that's, let's say, disrupted, and I don't mean to parrot government propaganda, because they like Vučić, the president, likes to talk about how these evil protesters have disrupted regular classes and stuff like that. But like, you know, these students have given up everything else to do this primarily. Can you give us some background on that, and also how they have been also repressed and targeted?
Sure. So the students have had a unique way of organizing, basically, in general assemblies, which I think formed the backbone of the organization. And even though we, as you already said, had protests since 2016 every year, this one is different because of the durability of this social movement. It has a strong infrastructure which is based at the university. And so the fact that it brought so many people around it and created maybe a largest mobilization for democracy in Europe right now, this year. Maybe Georgia was the biggest last year, but this year it's in Serbia, is a testament to their way of internal organization, which of course made a university a target of repression. So it's not only the targeting of students themselves, and the latest figures show that around 1,000 people have been not necessarily arrested, but taken by the police in the last 10 months at different places in different cities. So, and majority of them were probably students, so we can assume that. But the pressures on the university have also been strong. So I think in general, when we look at it, and I think it has to do with the resilience, the higher education is really, in Serbia, is a very good point of resilience to autocratization, and for several reasons, I think. One is that there were pressures at the university even last year. So before the protests have started, the government wanted to introduce a new law with which they would open up the doors for private foreign universities, and the public funding would go over there. And the university was already saying, no, we're not going to accept it. And already, so before the November 1st collapse of the canopy, there were already some conflicts. So university was heads to heads with the government. And then the fact that it did so has to do with the resilience of the institutions which maintain some autonomy. What we know about hybrid regimes is that all the autonomous spheres are being captured one by one. And miraculously, the faculties still have autonomy because of the way of their governance. Research institutes, no. Faculties, yes. Okay. And then what happened is that the student protest really made things differently. I don't think that the Serbian population would, you know, commit so much to the students' demands and to their protests if this was made by the faculty and the professors. There's a soft spot for the youth and for you know, the future of the country and for the students. And so everybody could identify with them. Everybody has a member of their family who is studying somewhere and so on. So this is really important. So the students and the faculty show that they can resist. The pressures were quite complex, and I don't want to go into details, but the faculty had their salaries cut for several months, I think, maybe even half a year. The government just introduced a new decree. At the faculties paid half and half, so half a salary because of their teaching and half a salary because of their research. And the government just brought a decree, so it's not about teaching. It's not about teaching. It's about research. And so basically, they were able, because they were not doing the teaching, because all the faculties were in the blockade, to cut their funding almost completely. And so the university showed that it can resist. And again, when you talk about resilience, whether it can actually turn the tide, I think that the student movement, who is now forming a list for the coming elections, and we can talk about it, is actually showing that the higher education can also serve as an actor and as an instrument of reversing autocratization. Which is like one of the greatest things that we can hope for, but maybe we'll see it this year or next year.
Yeah, I mean, the fascinating thing is, polls have shown that people currently trust the students more than they trust the opposition parties, which is extraordinary.
Yes, so the opposition parties have not been an active part of this. The student movement and the opposition parties are like basically same poles of the magnet. It's occasionally there are some attempts to bring them closer. It just doesn't work. I think it's a testament, and we talked about this already today, that the way that the country is ruled and the governing party also shapes the opposition and the attitudes towards the opposition. And after many years, so Serbia has had early elections. Very frequently in the last.
Except for now.
Years.
Now there
Except
aren't.
for now, yes. In general, we've had
the
elections.
Vučić refuses to, because one of the demands has been
exactly.
on and off to call early elections, and now he refuses to do so, or delays.
So we've had early elections every 2 years, or elections every 2 years in average. Only one parliament had a full term. And right now, the students have had their demands brought in December, which had to do with rule of law and accountability. The government collapsed, new government was replaced, and when the students realized that this government, this majority, does not have any intention to actually fulfill their demands, they called for new elections, which, of course, the opposition parties have to find a way to participate in this. So the students are going to probably, highly probably, going to have the list that they're going to support, but it's not going to be a list that's going to get into any pre-electoral coalitions with political parties. This is the biggest question mark probably, which has to do with our electoral system, the possibility of staying under the threshold that will maybe be a determining factor for the elections, which, regular elections, 2027, but snap elections, maybe 2026.
I mean, the fact that there are student-created lists where the students are reluctant to work with any existing party is already revolutionary on its own, on the continent and wider. But Ferenc, could you provide for our audience who might be interested in how this compares to, Hungary protest movements here, but could you provide some comparisons on both the political situations that could be triggers for these protests, but also on what it is in both of these countries that's making people so angry?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this question, and I like this question very much because Hungarians are generally very much interested in what is going on in Serbia. I mean, I oftentimes, when I give interviews, that always comes up, like, what are the synergies or what are the differences and similarities between the protests or between this kind of new reality that is happening now in Hungary and Serbia, and usually I only have like 10 seconds if I'm lucky to answer this. So thank you very much for this question. I authored a paper for Political Capital with the generous help, financial assistance by the Open Society Foundation Western Balkans, in which I dedicated, because of this, a separate section on, let's say, the synergies between Hungary and Serbia. And when it comes to, let's say, my main takeaways or main findings, I would definitely highlight the fact that the similarities or the root causes are the same or very similar, but the trajectories or how these different movements work or has been working in the past years are pretty much different. Case in point is basically what we cannot deny is that both regimes, both the Hungarian and the Serbian, are currently facing their #1 crisis yet. full stop. This is how we start the discussion. And the next point that I would like to make is that the root causes that basically triggered this entire situation that we are now living in are basically stem from the same issues, that is systematic problems, corruption, and also problems of economic nature. Ever since COVID, I would argue that in Hungary as well as in Serbia, there were basically no economic development. Inflation is over the roof, and just simply put it, Hungarian and Serbian citizens can feel it when they go to the grocery store. Let it be Lidl or Maxi. It doesn't matter. When it comes to, so this is why, so I would consider the root cause is the same. And this is why I consider the Novi Sad tragedy as well as the so-called presidential pardon scandal that we had in Hungary are not, let's say, like root causes, but the tipping points that basically triggered the protests or, let's say, this new reality that we live in. And basically, with regards to, let's say, one additional point, we can basically end the comparison. And another point that is similar is that between Serbia and Hungary at this point is the creativity that those new movements entail. Creativity in a way of how they organize themselves. For example, students from Belgrade walked and cycled to Strasbourg. Péter Magyar did his own hiking, or at least walking tour from the capital to Hungarian communities in Romania. Well, it wasn't hiking because you cannot really hike on the Hungarian Great Plains, but he managed to. But my point is that he managed to get into the ears and hopefully hearts of Hungarian voters that tend to vote for Fidesz, to Orbán in the last elections, and that is something remarkable, I would say, with the student protests as well, that could also grab the attention of the traditionally SNS voter base. Another interesting thing that I found is that the online presence is very strong, and although Serbians tend to go to the streets, which is very like symbolic and powerful, the online presence gives an additional layer to the resistance and keeping, let's say, the spiritus going. Also, that's the case in Hungary, where Péter Magyar is very much active on social media. He uses a lot of social media tools and campaigns successfully and effectively, once again, with the aim of reaching disillusioned Fidesz voters in the countryside primarily. But also what is very interesting, which can be similar but also different, is that Péter Magyar managed to somehow reclaim national symbols. National symbols that were basically for more than a decade attached to Orbán. As simple as that, the Hungarian flag, or as simple as that, talking to the Hungarian communities outside of the Hungarian borders. I know in the Serbian context, especially with regards to the protest on the 28th of June, with the involvement of speeches regarding Kosovo, talking about national symbols and reclaiming national symbols are, its own animal, its own different animal, but still, I mean, this in the Hungarian context, and I would say in Serbia, is something that we have never experienced or seen before coming from a politician.
I'm just going to step in very briefly to pull in Srđan. The national symbols thing is really important. I think to completely go into the national symbols at the Serbian protests, we would need another hour. And since everyone's been overtime today, I'm going to try to stick to our time slot, or not. But Srđan, could you just briefly tie into what Ferenc said? I wasn't planning on going down this line of questioning, but, or Vujo, if you want to, there has been toying with nationalist symbols during the protests. Is this a reflection of just the wide diversity of people who are participating, or is, as in Péter Magyar's case, one of the ways to get to a bigger group of people? Like, how would you define, obviously there have been very different types of influences on the protesters, but this aspect in particular?
Probably a bit of both, or what you said. you know, well, no, I mean, it has been, in a way, also a reflection of what people who are protesting think, because it's, as I said before, it's an incredibly wide social base. So there are many people who feel deeply about these national symbols and issues, and you know, you should not disregard that this generation of youth, however they're, you know, protesting against the regime, they have been shaped by the regime propaganda in the last 12 years, you know, so, you know, what they think is what has been served to them through the media as well before, you know. The fact that they reject the regime is good, but there are all of these elements that are there, but has been as well incredibly politically pragmatic. They know what the general population expects to hear, and they're serving this to the general population very ably. You know, when I told you that the spin of the regime has been shorted exponentially in terms of its duration and effect, this is it as well. When the regime starts talking about national symbols, Kosovo, whatever, it just simply doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I remember last year, just brief side note, last year when the lithium protests were happening, there was, you know, I was covering it as a reporter, and we got targeted by both pro-government outlets and people in the government, with the insistence, like, how can you support these protesters? They're all nationalists. But when the government needs to be nationalist on its own, it does things like erect statues to historical figures and do things in relation to, let's say, Kosovo or other topics that are nationally tinged. So I have found that fascinating, that when it needs to criticize protesters, then the nationalism stuff is bad. But when it wants to get, you know, its own attention, and it uses that as well. Vujo, I'm sorry, please, would you want to comment on it?
I can only confirm, I agree with Srđan. I think it reflects the pragmatism of the student movement that knows it has currently the support of the majority of the population, wants to translate that support into electoral support. And when we look at the polls and we try to analyze, like, who are the possible people who are going to vote for the student list, the biggest chunk of these people are pro-EU, let's say, civic-oriented or liberal or left people. That's the biggest chunk. Second biggest chunk is the sovereignists, so anti-EU, nationalist conservatives. Third one, so those are the people who would otherwise vote for the right-wing parties, so to say. And then the third groups are the abstainers. So people who were not involved in the politics, who did not want to do anything with any party, who are now actually considering to vote for this, you know, magical student list that we don't know what's it going to look like. And then the smallest part is probably is the former voters of the ruling party. So I think their line of thinking is that they need to avoid issues that will split the support, and they need to cater to all of these groups. So that's the general idea, I would say.
Just final question before I go to Andi, and it is actually a transition into more regional. Do you think the use of national symbols has perhaps, or imagery or rhetoric or whatever, has soured the regional perception in some countries on these protests?
I would say certainly. Yeah, most of the criticism, especially after the June 28th protest, which was on an important holiday, which has a big position in the Serbian national mythology.
How much time do you have for Serbian?
No, so I'm stopping there right now. So most of the criticism, I think, was on spot. It was a fair criticism, but it didn't take into consideration that this is one segment of the student movement, that this is one face of it, and that it has multiple faces, and that in the conditions where we cannot have a debate, honest political debate on most of the political issues in Serbia, so not on Kosovo, not on EU, not on Srebrenica, not any of those is being constantly, destroyed by the ruling party. In order to have a debate, we need to have a new political climate. And what students are hopefully going to do is to help bring this climate there so that we can have a good, honest political discussion in the future.
Andi, you've been patiently listening to everyone else.
Yeah.
So I think there's a great opening for you to come in on what have the reactions been? What do you make of the reactions of the EU so far? And how have the protests resonated with other countries in the region that face similar democratic challenges, let's say? There is, at times in the Western Balkans, there's been a tendency of like ripple effect protests. And there's a bit of that in North Macedonia after there's a nightclub fire in March of this year that killed 60 people and injured over 150 young people, and it has become a symbol of North Macedonia, of like the decaying system that kills its own in very many ways, like the canopy incident on Novi Sad. So how would you qualify the protests and their effects?
I mean, thank you, Una. Before I answer to your questions, just to break a bit the atmosphere and also just being grateful to people who have stayed until now, but you can obviously understand that this is really about Balkan, but just looking at us, in the panel. So, but I've been told that the next panel will be only women, so we'll have the right balance, like at least in the closing one. And I mean, usually when we describe the situations in the Balkan, I mean, before we used to say that, the situation was hopeless but not serious, At least we're living in a different era where the situation is serious but not hopeless, And I think the students in Belgrade has proven that there is hope, for things to change. And the regimes the states and the forms of the government in the region have gone through their own phases, as my friend Remzilani used to describe it, like we went from repressive to depressive. We're going back to repressive in some cases, so, and depressive, listen, it's in our DNA, to be depressive and self-ironic, but this is how we confront all the situations that we have in the region. I think that speaks to the survival also of the region. But going back to your question, I would summarize it very quickly, that the region continues to be caught in cycles of courage and inertia, and whereas youth energizes protest, still it has remained outside the domain of the politics. Unfortunately, also the weak oppositions have failed miserably to translate this outrage into change. And the governments, on the other hand, of course, have adopted various skillful containment strategies, like ranging from the velvet revolutions, etc., no need to go in all the details. And finally, also you have the EU's tepid, if I would say, at least until recently, when they started with, showing some strength in their statements, reactions, which of course undercuts the democratic leverage of this potential. And of course, across the region, the reactions to Serbia's protests have been rather, I would say, more reflective than contagious, The energy has traveled, but not the mobilization. And we saw this also in the Košane fires that you rightly mentioned, which was basically very much looking at the Serbian mirror, at the mirror in front of the Serbian, in terms of Serbian protests, but it failed to take up, and it failed to take up because of the government was very fast in using all the media delegitimization of the protests, people tired from the repeated tragedies in Macedonia, North Macedonia, and this, and of course also the fragmented political context, So you saw how fast, despite the efforts from various groups of students, this kind of died out quite fast. When it comes to, for example, to Albania and Montenegro, because of the path they are, in terms of being luckily now in the kind of considered as front runners. In Albania, basically the protests are kind of channeled through the opposition, which doesn't have much credibility, so it doesn't stick.
But Albania doesn't need a protest because it just launched its 2030 integration plan today.
Yeah, of course.
So everything's great in Albania.
Absolutely, especially in terms of the digital access, and the AI minister, so we're moving very, very fast, But still, it's a very positive, in overall, it's a positive momentum for both. In Montenegro, you saw the protests, you know, like which came against the 2 bills that the government introduced. So you can see that the nerve is still there, but still they are also acting quite cautiously in order not to create kind of different dynamics which would disrupt the European path, you know, which the country is like basically much more advanced, you know, than the rest of the region.
But Andi, you're someone who speaks to EU officials, right? And all these people who visit and stuff like that. And do you tell them like, hey, these protests should be a sign that what you want to happen is working? Like this is a democratic reflex. It's a knee-jerk reaction to inefficiencies in society that you want to correct yourself. Why isn't the EU support them greater?
Before I spoke to them, I think also the students from Serbia spoke to them quite strongly, you know. So, and we saw it initially even in the refusal of some of the EU officials to wait, you know, or meet the students, despite the fact that demonstratively, I mean, they took the bikes and they took all the walk, you know, basically towards all the EU institutions, you know. So, but I think it has come to the realization of EU officials, you know, that the usual talk on standards, you know, are not working, you know, the rhetoric or the mild approaches are not yielding. And of course, also, I think, also the government in Serbia has not helped much the situation, you know, by exacerbating even more the relationships, you know, or not even considering the chances, you know, to like start a conversation with the students, you know, despite the fact that these invitations have been merely window dressing, you know, rather than meaningful efforts to solve this, the situation. But to me, I mean, it has to do basically with the basic concept in my mind that, you know, the civic courage travels if it sees, I think, if it sees that the costs are predictable, but also the payoff is real, you know. So, and I think this is what is important in this context also in the region. And fortunately, EU holds both of these elements, you know, consistency of the message, but also I think the clarity is also extremely important. And I think it has empirically learned that, you know, if it is consistent and it has clarity, it also pays off, and the rest, the region can do itself.
Srđan and Ferenc, quickly on EU reactions to protests as well, if you want to say something. I think you need a mic. Ah, there you go.
I love the EU, let the record state that, but I also believe in tough love. Things are moving very slowly at the EU level, and I understand the caution that the EU has towards supporting students with political statements. But like I said, things are moving very slowly, and the testament to that is Enlargement Commissioner Mata Kos telling the public that there is indeed a problem in Belgrade, or the possible kicking out of SNS from EPP. But I still don't think that we have reached, from the side of the EU, a so-called Houston, we have a problem moment when it comes to Serbia. And somehow I get that, because Serbia is too important for the EU to be lost when it comes to its the EU's strategic interest, especially now with China, with the lithium, with the race for critical raw materials. And also there is this overarching EU narrative that Serbia can actually provide with regional security, and security not only for Serbia, but for the entire region as well. Let it be true or not, that's another question, obviously. So far, I wouldn't give the highest grade for the EU when it comes to supporting the protests. It does what it can do in a situation like this, which is once again very delicate. It needs to walk a very fine line politically so that Serbia wouldn't end up in a situation like Turkey.
But Srđan, isn't the very fact that they're not reacting more vocally on the repression of the protests or supporting them actually turning Serbs against the EU? So what Ferenc said, which is, you know, if they don't want to lose Serbia, but they're losing Serbia by not supporting the protests.
Of course, and this is not new. They have been losing Serbia for the last, you know, decade even because of these reactions, you know. But Serbia at this moment doesn't need European vocal support. They just need for them, and also when I say the EU, I mean other transatlantic allies, to stop buying this Vučić's bluff that he is willing and ready to move Serbia to the west, but he cannot because of the crazy Serbs, whatever he's telling them behind closed doors. Or accepting that his export of ammunition to Ukraine is something that, as a sign of him being pro-Western, I mean, this naivety needs to stop. We don't need support. We just don't need for them to support him. We don't need to be supported.
One more quick thing for Vujo. So now, the narrative, since we're talking about narratives as spins, that sort of autocratic leaders are using to quell the support for the protests. One thing that was in a couple of weeks ago was this, after escalations of violence and people getting beaten up at protests, Vučić started talking about how these people are going to, are very violent and we're going to provoke a civil war or something. Now he's trying to organize counter-protests where he participates. So we have an autocrat who's going to protest himself and like waving at the people as he goes down the streets. How do you qualify these two sort of tactics in like the later stages, in the latter stages of the protests?
It sounds paradoxical, and it is. So what the government was doing all the time was basically mirroring whatever the students were doing. They were doing the same. If the students have support of veterans or bikers, the government protests are going to have bikers and veterans. So it was almost ridiculous how everything was being mirrored. So basically, what we had for the last decade is that every time there is a major demonstration against the government is going to present it as a colored revolution. Friends from Russia are always helping. Just a couple of days ago, the Foreign Security Agency of Russia has, even said that this is a color revolution. There's going to be an escalation on November 1st and so on.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to emphasize, there literally was, so this is an EU candidate country that got a report from Russian secret services saying that the Serbian protesters were a new Euromaidan movement, Ukraine. And so both sending a signal like trying to worry, I guess, other people by saying that, this is things that are happening to Ukraine are going to happen to you because it's like Maidan, but also, saying, trying to delegitimize this as a revolution that was paid by the West and so on and so forth. Let Vujo finish and then
just one more point. So because I
hate being the moderator. I want to be the one talking.
I actually wanted to reflect on what Ferenc and Srđan were saying. So the lack of vocal EU support actually was a blessing in disguise in a way, because this narrative is a powerful narrative, but it didn't work. So most of the people in Serbia are not buying this, and we know this from the polls. Around 1/3 are actually believing that the student protest is part of a colored revolution, which is basically Vučić supporters. Nobody else is buying this. If it was for a much more vocal EU support, I'm not sure whether this would be the case. People who support the protest are supporting it irrespectively of whether the EU vocally supports it or not. People who support it but are skeptical of the EU maybe would have changed their opinion. So just a small footnote of the pros and cons of having a vocal EU support, which I think is missing, but there are some positive aspects of it.
Yeah, I just want to very briefly chime in on, let's say, like Russia's support, because it's not only Serbia but Hungary as well. I mean, a few days ago when I read this text, let's call it that way, or rumble of words by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, I needed to stop and check, because we had exactly the same like 2 or 3 weeks ago, but instead of Serbia, the words were changed to Hungary, obviously. But the message was clear and it was the same, and let me quote a few lines. It is the Maidan scenario. The respective protesters or whatever forces wants a regime change, a leadership loyal to Brussels. So in a way, it is not only, let's say, the Hungarian and Serbian regimes that show similarities, or if needed, somehow help each other with good practices, but it's always good to have a friend in need. And Russia is doing an excellent job in spreading its own gospel, which is obviously picked up by national news agencies and treated as a text holier than a saint, obviously.
Thank you very much.
Quickly, because you can see that this is a Balkan panel, like everybody's trying to grab the microphone. Yes. And we have the last 10 minutes. No, very, very, very interesting, you know, like, because we had the similar conversation with one student like a couple of weeks ago in Alba, actually. And it was a very interesting conversation exactly on the issue of, you know, European values and why EU is not present and the flags and symbolics, etc. But at least in the end we agreed that, you know, the students are basically have embraced the EU values, despite the fact that they are not coined as EU values. I mean, they represent like basic, fundamental rights, you know, like, and I mean, not starting and ending with transparency, but important rights like the free elections and the media, not captured by the system and by the government, etc. So, and I think it's very important that this should be understood, you know, like, because there is a bit of misunderstanding in the region that, you know, because these protests come from Serbia, you know, and they are not mentioning the EU, so there is this kind of also mystique, you know, built around it, and also kind of diffidence, you know, and mistrust in the sense like, is this going through the right values, or this is something that concerns only the domestic issues, you know? And I think it concerns more than the domestic issues, and this is where I thought, I mentioned also that, you know, this energy should travel also in the other countries of the region, because it embraces and it speaks volumes about the values that EU is pushing, you know, so.
Yeah, so the values have come out organically instead of being, seeming like they're being forced down the throats.
From the top down, exactly. They come bottom up, exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Sorry, please, Srđan.
No, just on the SVR communique, it was actually quite bizarre. I mean, it's not even a report, it's like a press release. Well, not only agencies and regime media welcomed it, but President himself in Serbia thanked and confirmed their writings. And what is really about his propaganda, what is really interesting, is he has been, the entire narrative of the regime has been that what's happening in Serbia is a colored revolution, inspired by the West, that he is writing a book about how I won the colored revolution. It's just the date of the publication is moving because it doesn't seem to be winning. But earlier this year, his diplomatic network has sent cables to all European capitals, maybe not this one actually, with some photos trying to depict the protests as Russian inspired, you know, so it kind of, by
hypocritical and also uncoordinated. One last round I'd like to go through everyone about like, where do you see this going in the future? Vujo really started us off well with the student lists and stuff like that. But in general, where do you see it going in the next couple of months? What are the concrete plans? What are things that you hope will happen? And then Srđan, and then Ferenc and Andi, if you could jump in with your closing statements.
So that's such a difficult question. To be honest, I don't know. When this started, I thought it's going to last for weeks, then it turns into months. Now I'm seeing that this is going to last for years. And this is going to be one of those momentous events that we are going to reflect back upon as some sort of like a little revolution. I've read a lot about revolutions, and I always read about how people are carried by emotions, how their values are being changed, but now I can basically see it, and I couldn't see this in any of the previous wave of the protest, such deep transformations of how people feel about things. People are not afraid of things anymore. They're not afraid of the government, of the sanctions, losing their jobs. They're not afraid of the police, of the gendarmerie. And that's kind of new. And this is, you know, that's maybe why a lot of other capitals don't like the situation, because it's unpredictable. Some people are afraid of it. I would guess like older people, people who depend on the state too much for their livelihood. But I think a lot of people in this uncertainty see the possibility of carrying things out. And of course, there's a lot of opportunism in this. But also there's a genuine potential for long-term political change. So in terms of months, I can't say anything. In terms of long-term effects, I see this as and we keep repeating this, there's no going back to the old way of things. And I'm only sure about this. When are the elections going to be? I have no idea. From 60 days until now, until 2027, everything is possible, and I can't spill beans. and figure this out. It has to do with domestic pressures, but more and more I think it has to do with international expectations of Vučić and of his cooperation in different fields. We didn't reflect on this much like in regards to the EU member states and the US, but I think more and more this will factor in.
One more follow-up question. Do you think that, do you think he'll be using, as the protests dig in and we enter year 2 or something, what are your fears about methods that he could use to try to suppress them? And Srđan, you can talk about that too.
I'm afraid for the university, because the student movement without the university is really going to lose this critical infrastructure that it needs. So we basically have 5 university cities in the country. University of Belgrade is by far the biggest one, and its administration and the faculty have been supportive for most of the time of the students. And I'm afraid of the sanctions and of the consequences for higher education in Serbia in the future. And a lot of sense, the gut feeling is that you know, everything is on the table right now. It's all in, and that there's no backing up, because if this movement fails, then a lot of sanctions will happen. There are announced changes to the criminal law, which would basically outlaw public protest in the streets. So things like this could happen, and of course it's very important to be vigilant and pay attention whether such changes to the criminal law and other critical laws will be introduced.
Yes, definitely. These amendments to the criminal code are worrying. The even bigger takeover of the security forces that is happening as we speak. So even, you know, heads of police units or units of the army that haven't shown absolute loyalty to the president are being replaced. But most worryingly, what it looks like, the hostile takeover of only 2 independent television stations in Serbia, that the regime is trying increasingly to put in place. And if this takes place, then this entire wave of repression will make it so that everything happens in the dark. So we will have really a Nacht und Nebel situation in Serbia. This is extremely worrying, but if you turn from inwards to the region, and I think with this government, there is only insecurity for the neighbors, insecurity geopolitically for Europe in the Balkans, and with any other government, I think our neighbors will feel a relief with a democratic government in the country. Well, maybe even them, because our relations are good anyways, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if I should give you my glasses half full or empty scenario, but I will try to balance it out. I will be closely watching at the hopefully or potentially the redemocratization process of Serbia, and this is a very difficult word to pronounce, or because it's not an easy process to carry out. But rest assured, the entire world is going to watch. If not the globe, then you know the Central and Eastern European countries are going to closely monitor the situation, to quote the EU, especially the ones that are basically facing the same state and institutional captures. I'm not sure if this can be carried out. This is my negative take. The positive take is that Serbia has the potential to become the prime example of this success story. And I will finish the sentence here.
Okay.
Positive note.
I mean, very, very quickly, of course, dovetailing on what Ferenc mentioned, EU finds itself currently between a rock and a hard place on many topics and many issues, and the region is not an exception to that. But as I mentioned, I think consistency of the messages is is extremely important because consistent signals raise the expectations for the payoffs, you know. Mixed signals depress it. So I think the answer is quite simple in that respect.
Right. Well, even though we started a little later, I'm only finishing at 5 minutes over time. I thank you very much for listening to us today, and I strongly suggest that you follow all of these wonderful people, the work that they do. They're very active on social media. They report, they cover. A big part of the way people across Serbia and in the region are staying informed about the protests is precisely because these networks of sharing information have been created, and if you're interested in following that, you have the name of the panelists, and you really should follow their work. So a great round of applause for their work and everything they said.